Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 50 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So as I record this, it's New Year's Eve. It's December 31st, 2019, and I'm headed to a friend's house in a little bit for a New Year's party with some other families, so looking forward to that. But today I have been working on this week's show, and I'm trying something new. So if you're listening to this tomorrow on the show, you'll be hearing the audio piece. But right now I am also simultaneously broadcasting live on Facebook. So there's a video that, some people you can watch live now if you happen to be on. It'll be on my Facebook timeline later. And so, by the way, if we are not connected on social media, you can find me at LiskJenny, LiskJenny, and that's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And then the video will also be on my YouTube channel later. So, yes, I have a YouTube channel. I haven't talked about it very much so far because I've been trying to build out the content for that, and I didn't want to share it until I had some good stuff there for you guys. I'm still building it out, but I want to go ahead and tell you about it anyway so you can jump in and get an early look. I do have most of my podcast episodes there, which you can listen to. It's audio only, but you can listen on YouTube. Also some behind the scenes videos, also starting to do some book reviews. I read an awful lot of interesting books as I prepare for interviews and learn about the subject. So I'm going to start reviewing more and more of those as videos as well on YouTube, and also working on something I'm really excited about for 2020, which is adding listener recommendations to my YouTube channel. So right now, testing that out with a few listeners and just trying to get some content created. So be on the lookout for that. Probably able to talk about that more in the coming weeks. So I'm really excited about that. It's kind of funny that I have a YouTube channel. I still remember, and I believe it was back in 2006, when my neighbor in Portland at the time said, "Hey, there's this new thing called YouTube." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, anybody can, create a video and share it with the world." And I remember saying, "Really? Like, why would you want to do that?" And look, here I am. What is this? 13 years later with a YouTube channel that I'm starting. So anyway, speaking of the past, the decade change that's happening now here in a few hours in my time zone, I guess sooner if you're in a different time zone, or maybe if you're one of my listeners in Europe or Australia, some other place you may already be in 2020 by the time you hear this. Anyway, I've been thinking about this concept of a decade change, and the first time I had a decade change was 1979, so that's going to date me a little bit here, I guess, but I was 7, approaching 8, and I remember my grandmother saying that it was the end of a decade. And at that point, I didn't even know what a decade was, so I didn't even know that was a thing that, you might think about chunks of decades and use it as a chance to look back or look ahead. The next decade I would have been 1989, New Year's Eve. I was a senior in high school and playing a lot of basketball on my high school team. And I remember writing a lot of college application essays that break, so I'm sure I was quite busy with that. The next decade changed, 1989. So the 90s for me, if the 80s were basically my entire, not early childhood, but the childhood that I remember plus my teenage years, and the 90s then were college and young adult years, and that's when I met my husband, and we got married in 98. I remember the changeover in 1989. Maybe some of you remember all of the hysteria about Y2K. I was working at a large tech company at the time, and there was a lot of concern. Nobody knew exactly what was going to happen and whether elevators would stop working and airplanes would fall out of the sky and banking systems would explode. So one of my first assignments was to make contingency plans in case bad things happen to all of our various systems around the world. And so I remember two things about New Year's Eve 1999, which I have to say, it does not seem like 2 decade changes ago. It seems like 1 decade change ago. But here we are. But I remember watching the New Year roll in around the globe and watching, all of our systems to see if there were any problems in some of the earlier time zones where it hit the New Year in Australia and then in Asia. And as we got around to Europe and we were hitting the New Year and nothing really bad was happening, I was then free to go to a really big, exciting, fun New Year's Eve party, which was at originally it was called the Glen Island Casino. I believe at that point it was called the Glen Island Country Club, but it's where Glenn Miller played way back in the day. And we were just, fairly new to New York, and it seemed like an exciting time to do something big and classy and classic like that. I think it was a black tie affair. We went with some family and some friends, and had a great time. Swing dancing, terrific food, just a really exciting way to ring in not only the new year, the new decade, the new century, and the new millennium, which sometimes I forget that it was actually a millennium change too. Not very many people get to live through that, but probably most of you, my listeners, obviously did live through that. But it's weird to think that my kids did not. They were born after that point. The decade changed, New Year's 2009. I don't remember what we were doing that particular New Year's Eve, but I do remember as far as a time in life, that's, we had 2 small kids, a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and a dog and a cat, and we each had jobs, and we had a house, and we were doing the normal life of a family with young children. But the 2010s, well, I guess it's the 20-teens, for me, and I'm guessing probably for many of my listeners, the 20-teens is when everything changed. So I think most of my listeners have lost their spouse within the past decade. So, and meaning, we started this past decade as, in my case, a family of 4, ended the decade as a family of 3, ended the decade with everything 180 degrees different than it was at the start of the decade. This is the year everything fell apart. Big changes. And, I look back on it and I think it's, it's time to, what am I trying to say? I don't know. I think that it's useful to think about the next decade and think about, now that I'm here, in my case, my loss was, it'll be 4 years ago next week. Something that I talked about, actually, not a lot on this podcast, but I was a guest on another podcast, the Life Through Transitions podcast with John DeWall. Terrific podcast if you have a chance to listen. He's got some really interesting guests. Anyway, this idea that we now finding ourselves, here now, if we've lost our spouses, we have to choose what the next steps look like, what the next days, weeks, months, years, what the next decade really looks like. And it's kind of a two-sided coin. I mean, as much as we would want to erase these changes of the past decade, erase what happened, wave a magic wand and restore things to the way they were at the start of the decade, the fact is we can't do that, no matter how badly we want to. So that means we have to choose what next looks like. And the kind of the flip side of the coin is we get to choose what next looks like. So, it's a burden and an opportunity. Where all of us are in a life we didn't choose, and now we get to choose what's next. I hope that makes sense. So I'm thinking about, I don't know what I want my life to look like when the next decade closes out. I heard another podcaster mention recently, as we're closing out 2029, a decade from now, what do we want our lives to look like? I don't know, but I know my life will look really different because my kids a decade from now will be 23 and 25. So I know there'll be huge changes in store for our family, whatever that might be. I don't know exactly what it'll be. but I know they'll be in different places. I'll probably be in a different place. I don't necessarily mean geographically, but, a different place in life. So I don't know what it looks like, and I don't think I have to know, but I think it's a worthwhile exercise, and I'd encourage you maybe to think about it if you have some, spare brain cycles as you're driving around or whatever you're doing, to think about, maybe defining some of these next steps and what comes next for you. It's hard to think, I think, about, what life is going to be like in a decade. I'm finding it easier to think about the coming year, so I wanted to share with you a little bit about that. Lots of exciting stuff coming up for the podcast. I think it's going to be the year of creating things. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, you won't be able to see the shirt I'm wearing. If you're watching on the video, I'll show you here. I think it's backwards, it's hard to see, but it says create every day. And it's actually my email provider sent me the shirt, but it's cool nonetheless. I love it. I wear it all the time. In fact, I might need to get another one. I think it's going to be the year of creating every day. I'll still be creating, of course, a weekly show for you guys. So there's a lot of creative work in that. It's funny. I did this just to go on a slight diversion. What do you call it? I can't think of what it's called. The VIA, the VIA character survey, where you answer all these questions and it comes up with kind of what your character strengths are and ranks them. And so creativity came up as one of my top ones. So anyway, there's a lot of creativity that goes into creating the show every week, thinking about the topics and researching them and how to put together a good discussion and story and set of information for you guys. So I look forward to continuing to create in that way. And then I'm also creating not one, but 2 books. I may be talking to you a year from now and saying, yeah, that was crazy, that didn't happen. But as of right now, my intention is to publish the first book, which is a memoir, in April, and the second book, which is the Widowed Parent Handbook, in November. And so the memoir, tentatively, my working title is Cancer and Caregiving, Helping My Young Family Survive My Husband's Terminal Illness. I'm not sure if I'm going to stick with that title, but I'm definitely framing it in terms of, look back. It's based on my Caringbridge journal, but looking back at, it's kind of like the predecessor to the podcast, to the widowed parenting piece, but how do you parent through a terminal illness as the spouse who is the one who's going to be the surviving spouse? What does that look like, and what do I wish I had done differently, and things like that. The second book, the handbook, so this podcast is actually research for the handbook. It's tentatively titled The Widowed Parent Handbook, A Guide for Widowed Parents to Increase Their Family's Well-Being. So I'm really excited about this one, and actually one of my tasks for this month is to try to create an outline for the book, which I've just been going around in circles trying to figure out what the outline should be, because it's such a broad topic, and I need to kind of narrow it down to a framework that makes sense. But anyway, I think I'm going to launch it in November because that's Children's Grief Awareness Month, so it seems like a perfect time to launch it. On the other hand, it just occurred to me a few days ago that November 2020 is also, at least in the U.S. here, a very large election, which will be very distracting. So it might not be the perfect time to launch a book, but I'm thinking with it being Children's Grief Awareness Month, I'll probably stick with November as the goal, but I'll have to give that one some more thought. Anyway, so lots of things I'm working on creating for you guys, and looking very much forward to that over the coming year. So as far as this week's show, so this is actually my first solo show. If you've been listening for a while, you'll notice that every single episode is an interview with somebody, a guest, an expert perhaps, somebody who's written a book, somebody who runs a grief center. Some are interviews with people who lost a parent when they were young and hearing their reflections and their journeys, and some are interviews with fellow widowed parents who are down the path a bit and can share their reflections and journeys. So, but this week I'm doing a solo show, my first one. So, it's been kind of fun to put it together. It's a look back at the best of 2019. So I was going to do a top 5 and pick out top 5 episodes to make some comments and then share clips from those episodes. And I was pulling together my list, and I narrowed it down to 6, and I just couldn't cut any of them to make it 5. And then I thought, well, who says it has to be 5, right? I mean, I decided it's my show. If I want it to be 6, it's going to be 6. So there you go. It's the top 6. But I guess if you think of it as a half dozen, then I guess maybe it's not such a random number. Anyway, for each clip here coming up, I will make some remarks introducing the clip and maybe about some things I learned from the guest. And then I will play a clip from that episode. And in the show notes, I will put all of the links to the episodes that we talk about in this week's show, and links to the books, in the cases of people who wrote books, link to those as well, and any other kind of key resources that come up in the course of the discussion. So I hope you enjoy listening to this week's show as much as I enjoyed putting it together. So, on to this week's show. First up in the Best of 2019 roundup, we have what was actually the very first episode of 2019, episode 7 with Austin Shoecraft. And Austin lost his dad when he was 11 years old. And I had such a great discussion with Austin. It's really been a privilege to speak with people who are now adults, some in their 20s or 30s, some in their 40s, who lost parents when they were young. And I learned so much from talking with them and hearing their perspectives on growing up after having lost one of their parents at a young age, either sometimes, very young, 3 years old, sometimes a little bit older, maybe, 11, 12, or even into, 18, 19 kind of college time. I feel like it really helps me to get a better sense of some of the issues that might come up with my own kids. Not that it's going to tell me necessarily exactly what they'll go through, but it gives me a lot of things to be thinking about, maybe to be on the lookout for. And so Austin and I had a fantastic discussion, and one of the things that I think I really first learned from talking to him was this idea that I really need to take care of myself and my own grief, not only for myself, that's important, and also so that my kids don't have to take care of me later. So Austin is part of this group called the Dinner Party, and he actually took some questions that I sent him ahead of time to his Dinner Party group and had a discussion with the 20 and 30 somethings there about their losses and their experiences. And this idea came up in their discussion that some of these young adults now in their 20s and 30s were having to take care of their surviving parent at a much younger age than might be expected. Not a case of somebody in their 50s taking care of an elderly parent, but really, young adults trying to start their own lives who maybe were taking care of their parents who are now themselves in their 50s or maybe 60s, but for whatever reason had not truly addressed their grief and figured out how to keep moving. And so now their young adult kids were taking care of them, essentially. So I thought that was a really important point, and for that reason, episode 7 with Austin Shoecraft is one of the best of 2019.
One of the questions you asked me was like, what did they learn by facing grief at such a young age? And a lot of people were like, how much you do have to grow up. Like you kind of lose partly being a child for some, and that's continued on like for now. So some people are having to take care of their parents who aren't like they're in their 50s or 60s, but they're not like they're kind of stuck and they have to help their parents like kind of live, like stopping by, making sure they're not like they're taking their meds and leaving the house and all this stuff. So it's like the roles have reversed, that they became so self-reliant and their parents kind of never were able to become so self-sufficient or never regained that the roles have kind of swapped.
Interesting. And most people don't have to face that with their own aging parents until they're much older.
Yeah.
Not in their 20s and 30s, but, maybe some later.
Exactly. So like I hear stories and I feel so sorry that like they're still grieving. Like they're coming to these dinner parties, they're still grieving. And then they have all these parental issues of like making sure their parents can take their meds and not drink and kind of take control of their lives, and they're upset that I need to live my life too. I lost out so much when I was a kid that I need to now take control and do my own thing, and it's hard. And they're like, I don't want to lose another parent, but I need to live my life too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Okay, all right. Thank you for sharing that. What other parts of the conversation that you think would be interesting here?
So maybe some interesting things from those who've lost like their parents when they were like 3 was like, I mean, there's always like the general dynamic of like some parents like remarry and some don't, and like one person kind of feels sorry that like their mom never found someone else, and like so like she was fine with it, and it's something that her mom could be open to, but she's never talked with her mom about it, so she doesn't know like why it never happened. Like it's been over 20 years, and now she's also starting to think of, well, when my mom gets older, I'm an only child. I'm going to be the one to take care of my mom, and so it kind of so it's kind of seeing like it's kind of like a slight selfish mindset, but also like trying to pay attention, like making sure like your parent takes care of themselves so that you don't have to.
So next up in the roundup of best of 2019 episodes, we have actually the very last episode of 2019, which was episode 49 with Claire Bidwell Smith. And Claire is a therapist, and she's written a number of books, including a memoir about losing her mom when she was a teenager and then her dad when she was a young adult. And she wrote a very interesting book called Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief. And I was able to interview Claire about her book. Fascinating book. I'd encourage you to read it, and I'll put a link in the show notes. I thought that it was really interesting to hear about the relationship between grief and anxiety. And Claire said that it's actually very, very common for people who are experiencing the loss of a close loved one to also be experiencing anxiety, whether it's in the short term or whether it's potentially many years or decades down the road, that if there is some amount of unresolved grief from a loss, that it actually can directly be related to that anxiety. So a really interesting discussion. I thought that I learned a lot and understood a lot more about anxiety from reading the book. An important topic, I think, particularly if you might be a parent who does not have anxiety yourself, but maybe have a child or a teenager who does. Really helpful, I think, to better understanding what anxiety is like and some ways to address it, and working with a therapist and processing that grief. In addition to, it's not, the sense that I got from the book is you wouldn't want to just tackle the anxiety kind of separately or standalone, that it's really important to tackle the grief piece along with it, particularly any aspects that might be unprocessed, any maybe lingering guilt or regret, definitely could lead to anxiety, Claire said. So a really fascinating discussion about this. And I hope you'll pick up the book, and I hope you will go back and check out this episode if it is of interest to you.
Well, if we're talking specifically about grief anxiety, which is, this whole thing, then I really feel strongly that it's a 2-part process, and they kind of go in tandem, but there's 2 components that have to be worked through. Really grieving and working on the grief and processing the grief is an enormously important part of it. If you're not processing your grief and you haven't worked through a bunch of the aspects of grief that are coming up for you, you're not going to be able to tackle the anxiety, because a lot of the anxiety comes from that. It comes from suppressing grief or not addressing things that are sitting with you, feelings of guilt or regret, or not having said goodbye, or just not letting yourself cry or get angry or feel all the things that come with grief. If you're stifling your grief, or you're getting messages from around you to stifle your grief, then that's going to manifest in anxiety. So really looking at, like, when a client comes in to see me who has been experiencing the grief-related anxiety, I first always check in with, like, where they are in their grief process. And they can be 20 years out from a loss. I work with a lot of people who lost a parent in childhood and adolescence and are now in their 40s, 30s, and they're kind of wanting to look at that and do some work around it. So we go back and we really look at, like, what was their grief process like, or what has it been like, and in what ways do they feel like they are grieving? In what ways do they feel like they're not grieving, or where are they suppressing it? Where is it scary? Grief is so overwhelming, as you know. It is so huge. It's so much bigger than most people understand, or anyone understands until it happens to you. The enormity of emotions can just be really overwhelming. The fact that you can drop to your knees sobbing in the middle of the day out of nowhere, it's a scary feeling, right? You feel very vulnerable and kind of nervous about when it will come on, or how to manage all those emotions. I mean, there's nothing else in life like it. So a lot of people do tend to kind of try to tamp it down or suppress it or run away from it. So the first thing I always do, again, is to really check in and sit with them and figure out where they are in their grief process. Where do they need to kind of dig deeper or release things or work through some stuff? From there, we start to look at the anxiety and how it's manifesting. Like, what are the symptoms? Are they panic attacks? Are they reoccurrent, obsessive thoughts? Is it hypochondria? Are they isolating? Is it social phobia? So starting to really look at the actual, how their anxiety is manifesting, and then doing some cognitive behavioral work around it, helping them understand what anxiety is, how it works, how to pay attention to their thoughts and notice them and figure out what it is that's, like, plaguing them and running through their heads over and over. And from there, we start to work on finding some freedom from those reoccurrent anxious thoughts. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of all done in tandem, kind of back and forth with the grieving and the anxiety pieces.
I always love it when I'm talking with one guest and somehow a discussion with another guest comes up in the context of whatever we're talking about. And this happened when I was talking with Claire Bidwell Smith about anxiety and grief, and particularly about the importance of trying to go back and kind of resolve or process unprocessed grief. She talked about Allison Gilbert and her book, Past and Present, Keeping the Memory of Our Loved Ones Alive. And I actually talked with Allison in episode 35. And actually I was really excited to see when I was reading Claire's book that there was references and quotes from Allison's book in there too. So that was really fun. My interview with Allison is definitely one of the highlights of 2019. I think that one of the reasons I really liked reading her book and talking with her is that she takes she has a really practical approach in her book. She's got 85 different ideas that people can use, including those of us who are widowed parents, can use to help keep the memories of our loved ones alive for ourselves and for our kids. She puts these practical ideas in a really important construct, with the backdrop of a lot of research done by leading grief researchers and thinkers and practitioners. And in this clip, she talks particularly about J. William Worden, who's done a whole bunch of work about grief and frameworks for understanding and processing our grief. So with understanding that context and the importance of keeping those memories alive, the importance of creating a new relationship with the deceased, and using some of these practical strategies to help do that. So one of the things I love about the book is that it's not a project book per se. This is not a Martha Stewart, you must be crafty in order to use this book. There are crafty projects in there, and Allison has actually gone and vetted vendors, small business people, local business people, other providers who can do some really cool things with the possessions of your loved ones. So, for example, she's got on her Pinterest page, I think, where if you had perhaps a military fatigues of a loved one who died, and then she's found somebody who can convert those fatigues into a really cool looking duffel bag, so that somebody can have that as a special keepsake to remember their loved one. Tons of other ideas. They're not all crafty. Some of them use technology in various ways. Some of them involve travel, all kinds of things. So I hope you'll check out the book. And in this next clip, Allison talks about the context for this and the importance of keeping the memories of our loved ones alive.
So here is part of the introduction to past and present keeping memories of loved ones alive. When someone we love dies, we usually benefit from being passive recipients of support. Between the rituals of burial and the recitation of certain prayers, between the wakes and Shiva calls, the bereaved and those who console them know their role and take their place. But consider the vacuum that happens later. I've never met anyone who's completely stopped thinking about the person he or she loved. Our memories flood in and out and wash over us at anticipated and unexpected times. Yet, for the most part, a year after, 5 years later, 15, the outreach that once provided so much comfort is mostly gone. When it comes to keeping the memory of our loved ones alive, that work is up to us.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And I love that you start right out, I think it's the very first sentence, you say, this book is not about sadness and grieving. These pages are about happiness and remembering.
I think that you have to honor the sadness first. Mm-hmm. You have to make sure that you have acknowledged, accepted, and come to a little bit of terms with the finality and the pain of what you've just been through. Mm-hmm. Then you are ready to shift, move forward, and launch into what will be the new state for the rest of your life, which is to embrace, in my words, the word and, A-N-D. You can have this incredible relationship that was. You can be sad and you can grieve, and you can move forward, keep their memory alive, and embrace what is to be going forward. But it doesn't have to be either or. Mm-hmm. I think the critical word is and, A-N-D, and that's why I called the book Past and Present. And past is a play on words, right? It's past as in P-A-S-S-E-D, passed away, so to speak. So past and present. And the and is there deliberately. I really do feel that there can be this partnership between these two extremes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for expanding on that. And I wanted to, I guess it circles back to what you were mentioning in the beginning, but I know you've talked a little bit about William Worden and his tasks of mourning. Can you tell us a little bit about why remembering is such a critical task of mourning?
Yeah, well, J. William Worden is somewhat of a hero of many of us in this space. If you don't know his name, I promise you it'll be well worth your while to do a quick Google search. The first initial is J period, William Worden. And he has really been this incredible light in terms of putting words to what we now all know is completely the case, which is in order to be fully, this is a very scientific way of explaining it, but in order to be fully, quote unquote, resolved in your grief, that doesn't mean you're not sad anymore. It just means to be fully resolved in your grief, one must keep memories alive. And if you don't keep memories alive, you are actually inhibiting your growth and your ability to keep these connections close. There's something else that many grief experts point to, and that's continuing bonds. How do you continue? How do you maintain? How do you ensure that there's longevity to those relationships that are so important to you? And so I really, to go back to J. William Worden, this task of mourning, one of the key pieces, one of the 4 tasks is remembering, is keeping the memories of our loved ones alive.
Another one of my favorite episodes of 2019, way back in January, episode 11 with Lane Pease of Kate's Club, which is in Atlanta. It's kind of fun to go back and listen to some of these early episodes. Anyway, I had such a great discussion with Lane, and I learned a lot from her. And one of the things that I learned was that traumatic grief is a different thing than regular or adaptive grief, non-traumatic, I guess, grief. And the fact that traumatic grief can happen in cases that you might not necessarily guess would be traumatic. So I think it's perhaps intuitive that a cause of death like suicide or a homicide, a drug overdose, might be traumatic. But there are also, you can experience traumatic grief in other types of deaths. And the really interesting thing that Lane said is that there's some new research showing that actually in kids versus adults, that those types of death that I mentioned before tend to be the most traumatic. But if you take those out of the equation, adults tend to be more likely to experience traumatic grief in a case of a sudden loss, a sudden cardiac incident, a sudden accident, an unexpected sudden loss. And kids, actually, it's the opposite, tend to be more likely to experience traumatic grief with a lengthy illness, a lengthy cancer type experience, as opposed to a sudden death. Fascinating information, and I'm looking forward to digging into that some more and bringing you some more information about that. The other thing, and what Lane talks about in this next clip, is this notion that kids are resilient. And if you've been listening for a while, you may have noticed that I do ask a lot of my guests their opinion on this topic. It's interesting, the responses, a variety of responses, I think depending on the person and their experience and whatever their particular experiences lead them to think about this. But I really thought that Lane's answer was a good one, and that, kids are not necessarily any more resilient than the rest of us. So have a listen to this clip from my interview with Lane Pease. My next question, and I think this will kind of segue us into the topics around Kate's Club and your work there. Sometimes I hear the conventional wisdom, kids are resilient. And, and it's kind of said with, what, love them, they'll be fine. And I'm wondering what your reaction or thoughts about that are.
It's funny that you said that, because that's probably one of my least favorite phrases in the human language. The English language, I would like to, sometimes I want to shake people when they say that, because I think they have, I've said in a training, I actually spoke on resilience at a training a couple of years ago, and I said, I think we want kids to be like little bouncy balls that you get out of the gumball machine, where they bounce back from everything automatically. And they're not. Now, they're not the medicine ball you use in gym class that you can't pick up.
You can't bounce back at all, right?
A basketball, where you need help to bounce it. And that was my analogy I came up with. I was very proud of that.
Yeah, that's a good one.
We know children can be resilient, but we know there's factors that have to do with building resiliency in them. They are not automatically any more resilient than we are, or that anybody, just because they're young does not mean, if anything, they're very vulnerable to a lot of things. Losing a parent in childhood is one of the most adverse events that can occur in a child's life. So to just say they're resilient, they'll be fine, is not enough. Things that build resiliency in children are having at least one trusted adult in their life. It's having, adequate support so that they're not, if you're worried about other things like where you're going to sleep, what you're going to eat, those things, it's very difficult. We know that giving them a voice and giving them choices with clear boundaries, those are all things that build resilience, but they're not resilient just because they're young.
Okay, so next up we have episode 43, which was my discussion with the folks over at Judy's house in Denver, Jessica, Maitland Mayo, and Micki Burns. Loved talking with them. Multiple parts to this discussion. First of all, Jessica is herself a widowed parent, so we talked about her journey and her reflections. Secondly, Judy's house is a provider of children and family services for grieving families in the Denver area, so we talked about their programs. Love doing that. That one in Denver, Kate's Club in the last segment in Atlanta, other ones that I've talked to. Love being able to highlight those resources for listeners in various locations. I think perhaps the most interesting thing for me about this discussion and the research and reading that I did preparing for it, and I guess this is going to bring out my geeky side a little bit. I loved reading this academic paper that they wrote. And Micki Burns, who's one of the people I interviewed here, was one of the co-authors on that paper. Really outlined the state of the need in this space of children's grief and what the stakes are, why it's a critical public health issue, and fascinating, I think, highlighting the limitations of the current support models available. And this is probably mostly a U.S. statement. I'm looking forward to learning more about some of the other countries and what's offered and what kinds of grief services may be offered in other locations around the world. So I'm looking forward to digging into that. But from a U.S. perspective, I think what this helped me understand is that there's kind of you kind of group the support options into two main categories. There's the peer support model, and so a lot of grief centers in different locations, perhaps a nonprofit, perhaps they have maybe a combination of trained clinicians and trained peer support volunteers as well. So there's that kind of aspect, and then the other option is what you might call the medical model. Therapists and people who are working under the system of insurance reimbursement and the limitations of that as far as needing to have some kind of diagnosable problem in order basically for insurance to pay for counseling, and the fact that grief in and of itself not being a diagnosable condition then does not qualify as an insurance reimbursable type of therapy. So I just found that really interesting, and the idea that you would have to get to the point where you have some other diagnosable issue, like for example anxiety, depression, other things, in order to qualify for that type of support. So I think this paper that they put out and then also our discussion really helped me to understand a lot better that situation. So in this next clip, Micki and Jessica talk about some of the research they've done and some of the reasons why childhood bereavement really is a critical public health issue and how they've partnered with the New York Life Foundation in working to address this.
It's astounding that 1 in 14 children in the U.S. will experience the death of a parent or sibling by age 18.
Wow. Okay, wait. Let's just break that down. Mm-hmm. By the age of 18, and we're talking about the death of a parent or a sibling, so a very close family member, not all other types of losses. 1 in 14 kids nationwide?
Yes.
Wow. That seems like a lot.
Well, I think also, Jenny, it underscores when we think about the work that needs to be done is to elevate the understanding that this really is in its own way a critical public health issue that needs to be awareness raised and resources provided. And I think because it's around death and loss, sometimes our communities can feel like, well, that just happens. So that's part of our world. But if we can help people understand how incredibly prevalent this is, and that's why awareness needs to be there and resources need to be there.
Yeah. Okay. So let me dig into that a little further. So you say it's a public health issue. So what does that mean? Why is it a public health issue? Why isn't this just a problem that, okay, my family had a loss, it's my problem?
I think that it's prevalent throughout our entire, you can see the effects if we have unaddressed grief, complications, things that are not dealt with in so many different places of our society. And if our public as a whole is working through these issues and we're not providing resources, the potential negative outcomes, they can be significant.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think it was in the 90s that we really kind of stood up and said, wow, there's this thing called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. There's a study that came out. It was the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente. And what they found is if you experience 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences as a child, you had all of these negative health outcomes. So you were more likely to be obese. You're more likely to abuse substances. You're more likely to have heart disease. Like all of these negative things were correlated with having adverse childhood experiences. Well, guess what? Losing a parent or sibling in childhood is an adverse childhood experience. And what the research is showing us is there's a similar pattern here, that if your grief goes unaddressed, you end up, it starts out with being absent from school more often. And then we start to see decreased performance. And then we see that maybe you're having difficulties in your relationships, or you're having a hard time managing your emotions. And over time, if that continues to go unaddressed, it becomes depression, it becomes anxiety, it becomes substance misuse, it becomes suicidal ideation. And so if we don't address childhood bereavement, if we don't create preventative programs like we have at Judy's House and so many other programs across the country, then this is a public health issue that we're paying for and we're addressing in other ways. It's showing up in emergency rooms. It's showing up when we go to our care providers and we're struggling with regular health diagnoses and disorders that could have possibly been prevented if you were provided the services that you needed when you lost your dad or when you lost your sister. And so that's really, I think, where we have been coming upon this. This is a critical public health issue. There were 2 studies released in the last probably 5 or 6 years that showed that experiencing the death of a parent or a sibling in childhood leads to earlier mortality. So
really,
yes. So if you don't get the support you need now, and there's not enough research to say, well, what exactly leads to it? It's just a correlation, looking at people who had this experience and at what age do they die, and looking at people who didn't and what age do they die. And adults who experience this as a child are more likely to die younger. And I don't want to paint too grim of a picture here. I mean, I know that many of your listeners, Jenny, are people who are like, well, wait a minute, that's my kid you're talking about. And what we also know from the research is that by accessing services, by accessing prevention, by accessing your community, your church, your school, and getting people to wrap around your children like Jessica did, that it doesn't have to be the outcome in your family. And we need that article that you mentioned. We need for legislators, we need for communities, we need for funders to recognize this and provide us with the resources we need to continue improving our programs so that we can see these children get back on a normal, healthy trajectory and thrive and survive the way that we all know they can.
Okay, so rounding out this episode with the best of 2019, my discussion with Dr. Lisa Damour, which is in episode 13 back in February. Lisa is the author of several books on parenting teenage girls in particular. She also writes a column for the New York Times on parenting teenagers in general, not just girls. And I'll put a link in the show notes because there's tons of good topics. She's written quite a few columns for them, many different topics related to teenagers. Anyway, her book, Untangled, Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood, terrific book. Loved it. I learned so much from this book. Even though I was a teenage girl myself once, obviously, I found that I just learned a ton about the developmental tasks of being a teenager, what teenagers are going through as they transition from being a child to being an adult. And she outlines 7 different strands, I think she calls them, along which teenagers need to develop in order to make that transition. So we talked about all kinds of things, what it looks like partying with childhood, what this looks like, when to be concerned, about, the emotional volatility of teenagerhood. She's got a terrific quote from Anna Freud about, and talks about teenagers kind of being all over the map as far as behavior. And so, if that's the case, then what is normal and when should you be concerned is essentially how the book is organized. So I encourage you to have a listen to the episode, and if you have a teenage girl, to pick up the book Untangled. She's also got another book that came out this year, Under Pressure, Confronting the Epidemic of Stress and Anxiety in Girls. So that's an excellent one as well. I should note, for parents of teenage boys, I am still looking to find out who is maybe what you'd call the Lisa Damour of teenage boys. So when I get that sorted out, I'm looking forward to doing an episode specifically on teenage boys. Anyway, for this next clip, I had asked Lisa, based on something that I hear a lot from widowed parents, how do you know if something is a grief issue, or how do you know if something is a normal teenage issue? How do you know if something is, as a behavior that you're seeing is something to be concerned about, or something to chalk up to a normal teenage behavior and maybe not to be particularly concerned? And for example, I asked her, in this case, if your kid is 12 or 13 and they're starting to separate and they're closing themselves in their room and saying, "Go away, I don't want to talk to you," how do you know if that is because that's what kids tend to start doing at that age and it's normal teenage behavior and you shouldn't worry? Or how do you know if maybe they're closing themselves in their room because of anxiety, or they're isolating because of depression, or any one of, a number of things that might be a cause for a concern that might warrant some additional investigation or intervention and so forth. So in this next clip, she talks about what I think is a really handy guidepost for thinking about, any particular, when you're thinking about your teenager and their issues you might be seeing about whether or not there's a cause for concern.
So there's a few ways to slice this. I think at the more granular level, I'm a huge believer in just asking kids very straight questions. So I think in a moment when things are good and you're chatting and it's relaxed and the child doesn't feel cornered, you could say, okay, some days you come home from school and you hole up in your room and I can't tell if something's wrong or not. Mm. How would I know if something were wrong? And I think actually just asking, if you ask a kid a straight question, it is amazing how often they will give you a very straight answer.
Huh, okay.
So that's a place, or even if you storm off to your room and then don't come out for 3 hours, how will I know when I should actually make a thing of it, and how will I know just to leave you be? Can you give me any, guidance here?
Okay.
I think an overarching principle, and this actually comes from Anna Freud, who you can tell I really admire her work. I mean, her work is very, very old. In terms of knowing if something's really going wrong for a child, and this is so valuable in adolescence when normal adolescence is such a chaotic time and teenagers can be kind of difficult and, hard to understand. The definition is if there's an interference with progressive development. Mm. So the way we want to think about it is that it's a kid's job to grow, and they're growing in all these ways. They're developing their social skills, they're developing their academic and intellectual skills, they're becoming increasingly physically autonomous. They can take better and better care of themselves and their own bodies. They are able to manage their feelings with increasing, kind of sophistication. They don't hit, they don't, do inappropriate things. They either talk about their feelings or they use good coping strategies. And so there are all of these ways in which we expect to see kids grow. And the sign that something really is amiss is that their growth has stopped, in one of these domains, that they are not able to maintain friendships, or they are not developing at school intellectually, or their ability to care for themselves is either not progressing or going backwards, right? Or their handling of hard feelings seems like they're not developing an increasing capacity to handle difficult feelings well. That's actually how we measure clinically whether something is amiss with a kid. Because teenagers have meltdowns all the time. Mm-hmm. Like, that kind of comes with having a teenager, is that they're going to have a meltdown. We wouldn't say that about a child, well, toddlers for sure, but we don't expect 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds to have meltdowns all the time. But we do expect 13-year-olds have meltdowns pretty often. And so that's where that Anna Freud quote that we started with is so useful, which is like, they're going to be all over the map. They're going to be charming and horrible, often in the same 10-minute space. All of that's really to be expected. What matters is if they stop growing.
I hope you enjoyed hearing about some of my favorite episodes of 2019 as much as I enjoyed putting this show together. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com and look for episode 50. There were, of course, many favorite episodes this year. I think I could name at least one favorite thing about every single episode. A few others that I didn't mention, probably because I've talked about them more recently on social media and in the 1-year anniversary episode, my discussion with the folks at Hamilton's Academy of Grief and Loss. First of all, because they're so knowledgeable, we had a great discussion. I think it was the longest episode, actually, that I've done, and it's one of the ones that I recommend to new widowed parents, just because we covered so much ground, so many different topics, and I think a lot of really useful information. And because they have a fantastic resource library on their website. It's all free. There's a whole bunch of 1- and 2-page downloadable, printable PDF documents on every grief-related topic, broken down by age group, by type of situation, type of loss, by particular challenge. So just a wealth of good information there. Another favorite, of course, my discussion with Dr. Justin Yopp. He is, of course, the co-author of the book, The Group, 7 Widowed Fathers Reimagine Life. And it's been terrific to have that as a resource to recommend to widowed dads. I've had quite a few new listeners recently who are widowed dads, and I've been hearing from a bunch of them, which has been awesome. And actually, one of the dads joined our discussion group in December, so that was terrific as well. Justin is, of course, doing, they started with focusing specifically on widowed dads, and they've broadened it now more recently to do some research and some other work with widowed parents in general. So that was another great episode. And then also my discussion with Tembi Locke, mostly because I just enjoyed reading her terrific memoir, and because it is going to be a movie on Netflix, so be on the lookout for that. I think that my favorite quote from one of the episodes this year, and I think because it really encapsulates why this is so important and what this is all about. And so when I was talking with Vicki Jay, and she is the CEO of the National Alliance for Grieving Children, she said, "It's my belief that the earlier we can provide support for anybody who's had a loss, then the healthier adult that person is." And she went on to say, "It's much easier to support a grieving child than it is to heal a broken adult, for instance." And I thought that was such an important point, and I think it really speaks to why I'm doing the podcast, and I think what a lot of us as widowed parents may be thinking: how do we support our kids? How do we help them now with whatever kind of support they might need, so that they can hopefully go on, in spite of this tragedy of losing a parent at such a young age, go on to be, whole and healthy human beings as adults. I think that's what we're really all shooting for. So I love talking with Vicki Jay. As far as what was the most fun for me this year, hands down, I think that was my discussion with Karen Millsap for the special 1-year anniversary episode of the podcast. So that ran in November, and actually it ended up being a 2-part interview because we had so much to talk about. Part 1 being my journey to how I became a widowed parent, talking about when my husband was sick and that period of time, and kind of how I got to this point. The most fun was part 2, that was talking all about the podcast, how I started it, why I started it, and especially what I have learned so far from my guests. And it was important to me to share that because I think that, we've got 50 episodes now, a lot of different topics week to week, so many different, diving deep on so many different aspects and topics and elements of widowed parenting. And it was important for me to pull out some of the key things that I've learned, kind of as a summary for listeners to maybe point out, kind of step back and look at the broader picture a little bit and pull out some of the key summaries and key learnings. So I would encourage you to have a listen to that if you missed it. Plus, Karen's awesome, and I really need to extend again a huge thanks to her for taking her time to take over my microphone and interview me for my own podcast. So it was just a lot of fun to do that. So thank you again to Karen. One thing I'd like to ask, actually, as we close out 2019, if you guys don't mind, please make sure you're on my email list. So if you're listening every week, that's terrific. If you have subscribed in iTunes or Google Podcasts or Stitcher or Spotify or any other podcast platform where you like to listen to podcasts, that's terrific. If we're connected on social media, fantastic, and please keep interacting there. I'd love to hear from listeners. It is also important to be on my email list because of social media and the way they have different algorithms for deciding who sees what posts. It's very, very easy to miss a post. So if we're connected there, that's terrific. Like I said, you might easily miss something week to week. So if you're on my email list, then absolutely you'll get a notice each time there's a new episode. And anything else that's going on that I think you might be interested in knowing about. So it's really easy to get on my email list. Just go to jennylisk.com, JENNYLISK.com. And at the bottom of probably almost every page, there's a short form. You can just put your name and your email address, and then you'll be on my list. So a big thank you in advance for doing that. Love to make sure that I can stay in the loop with all of you guys and keep bringing you good shows each week. So with that, I think we will close out 2019. Thank you very much for listening this year, and I look forward to talking to you more in 2020. And until then, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.